Picture this. It's the year 1300 AD. You're standing in a canyon in what's now the American Southwest, and the wind is the only thing making noise. Around you are stone rooms stacked 4 stories high, built into the face of a cliff, kivas dug into the earth, still holding the shape of ceremonies, grinding stones sitting exactly where someone left them mid-task, corn cobs in storage rooms, pottery stacked and ready to use. Everything you'd need to keep living is right there. Except nobody's home. Not one person. Not in this canyon. Not in the next one. Not in the hundreds of villages and great houses scattered across an area the size of a small country. This is Mesa Verde. This is Chaco Canyon. This is the Four Corners region where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. And sometime around the late 1200s, after centuries of building, farming, trading and thriving, the people who lived here left. Not just from one town, from the entire region, hundreds of communities, tens of thousands of people walking away from homes their ancestors had occupied for generations. Here's the question that's kept archaeologists arguing for over a century. Why? Why would an entire population uproot itself from a landscape they had mastered, from cities they had spent lifetimes constructing, and simply move on? Was it fast or slow? Was it planned or forced? Did it happen everywhere at once? Or did it ripple outward over decades? And maybe the biggest question of all, where did everyone go? Now, before we go any further, I have to be honest with you about something. The idea of an entire civilization abandoning their cities all at once, all in a single dramatic moment, that's the kind of headline that gets clicks. It's the kind of story that sounds like something out of a lost civilization documentary, complete with mysterious vanishings and unanswered riddles. And there is some truth buried in that drama. But the real history is messier, slower, and honestly more interesting than a single mass exodus. This wasn't one event, it was a series of decisions, pressures and migrations that unfolded over generations, shaped by drought, by conflict, by belief, by survival. Calling it an instant disappearance is dramatic shorthand. What actually happened is a puzzle with edges that don't always line up. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to dig into the real evidence. Tree rings that tell us about a drought so severe it reshaped an entire way of life. Skeletal remains that hint at violence and fear creeping into once peaceful communities. Architecture that shows people building walls where there used to be open doorways. And the oral traditions of Puebloan peoples today, the direct descendants of these communities, who have their own explanations passed down through countless generations, explanations that outside archaeology is only beginning to take seriously. We'll look at where the evidence agrees, where it contradicts itself, and where honest uncertainty is really the most accurate answer we have. Before we get into it, I want to know where you're listening from and what time it is right there. Drop it in the comments. I read them constantly, and it's wild seeing this show playing at midnight in Manchester and lunchtime in Manila, all in the same thread. And if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive, the best way to support what I'm doing here is simple. Follow the show on Spotify, listen there when you can, and if you've got a spare minute, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. Links in the description. Alright, let's rewind the clock. Long before the canyons went quiet, they were full of life. To understand why people left, we first need to understand who they were, and just how much they built before it all changed. Let's start with a term you're going to hear a lot throughout this story. Ancestral Puebloan. And here's the first thing you need to know about it. It's not what these people called themselves. Nobody woke up in the year 900 AD and said, "I'm an ancestral Puebloan, off to build a great house today." This is a modern label coined by archaeologists trying to describe a vast, complicated, and genuinely diverse collection of communities that lived across the American Southwest for well over 1,000 years. Think of it less like a nationality and more like a category, a way for researchers to talk about related but distinct groups without pretending they were all the same. And that distinction matters more than you might think, because for decades this same population was called something else entirely: Anasazi. You've probably heard that word before. It shows up in old documentaries, in dusty textbooks, maybe even in the name of a hiking trail you've walked without thinking twice about it. But Anasazi isn't a word these communities used for themselves either. It comes from Navajo, and depending on how it's translated, it can mean something like ancient enemies or ancient ones who are not us. Understandably, the modern descendants of these communities were not thrilled about an outside group's word being used to define their ancestors, especially a word that essentially labelled them as somebody else's historical rival. So, over the past few decades, archaeologists and Puebloan communities working together shifted toward the term Ancestral Puebloan. It's not perfect, no single label could be, but it's a meaningful improvement, and it points to something important that we're going to keep coming back to. These people have living descendants today. This is not a lost civilization in the sense of the word lost. Nobody vanished off the face of the earth. We'll get into exactly where they went a little later. But I want that fact sitting in the back of your mind for the rest of this video, because it changes everything about how we should be interpreting this story. Okay, so now let's talk about where all this was actually happening, because the geography here is not just backdrop. It's basically a character in the story. The heart of this world is the Four Corners region, the only place in the United States where 4 states meet at a single point: Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. But this region is so much more than a neat cartographic novelty. It's an area of staggering environmental variety packed into a relatively compact space. You've got high plateaus and deep sandstone canyons. You've got mountains that catch snow through the winter and deserts that bake under summer sun, just a short distance away. You've got river systems, the San Juan, the Chaco Wash, the Rio Grande, that could support agriculture in some seasons and betray farmers completely in others. Elevation alone in this region can shift by thousands of feet within a day's walk, which means climate, rainfall, growing seasons, and available resources could look completely different from one valley to the next. This mattered enormously for the people living there, because it meant no single strategy for survival worked everywhere. A farming technique that thrived in a river-fed lowland might fail completely on a wind-scoured mesa top 100 miles away. Communities had to adapt constantly to their specific patch of land, which is exactly why you shouldn't picture this world as one uniform society stamped out across the landscape like a cookie cutter. It wasn't. It was hundreds of individual communities, each shaped by their own particular slice of desert, canyon, or plateau, each developing their own architectural styles, their own pottery traditions, their own social structures, and this brings us to something crucial for understanding everything that comes later in this story. There was no ancestral Puebloan empire, no central government sitting in one city issuing orders to distant provinces. No single ruler whose decision to abandon a capital would explain why an entire region emptied out. If you're picturing something like the fall of Rome, a centralized power collapsing and dragging everyone down with it, you need to let that image go right now. What we're actually looking at is closer to a network. Independent villages and larger centers connected through trade, through shared religious practices, through intermarriage and alliance, but each one making its own decisions about when to build, when to move, and when to leave. This is exactly why the mystery we're exploring today is so much more interesting than a simple story of one empire falling. We're not asking why a single government collapsed. We're asking why hundreds of separate, self-governing communities spread across a massive and environmentally diverse landscape all seem to have made remarkably similar decisions within a relatively similar window of time. That's a very different kind of puzzle. Now, before we jump forward to the dramatic centuries right before the migrations, I want to make sure you appreciate just how much history had already happened by that point. Because this wasn't some fragile, newly established society caught off guard by hardship. These were people with an extraordinarily long track record of figuring things out. Farming in this region stretches back well over 1,000 years before the events we're focusing on today: corn, beans and squash. The classic trio archaeologists sometimes call the Three Sisters had been cultivated and refined across the southwest for centuries, adapted generation after generation to survive in arid, unpredictable conditions. Trade networks stretched incredible distances. Turquoise mined in the southwest has been found as far away as Mesoamerica. Macaw feathers and copper bells from Mexico turn up in southwestern sites hundreds of miles north of where those materials originated. These were not isolated communities scratching out a bare existence. They were connected participants in a continent-spanning exchange of goods, ideas, and probably beliefs. And the architecture. We're going to spend serious time on this in the next section, because honestly it deserves it. Multi-story stone buildings, cliff dwellings tucked into canyon walls, massive ceremonial structures called great houses that required coordinated labour and long-term planning to construct. This was engineering. This was urban planning. Centuries before anyone in Europe would think to call the Southwest anything other than empty land. So, by the time we reach the centuries right before the Great Dispersal, we're not looking at a young, untested society. We're looking at people with deep roots, sophisticated systems, and a long history of adapting to one of the most challenging landscapes in North America, which makes what happened next even harder to explain. So, what did this world actually look like when it was alive? Not one city, not one capital, not one giant civilization gathered behind a single wall. It was a landscape full of communities, spread across mesas, tucked into canyons, clustered beside washes, and built wherever people could find a combination of workable soil, water, timber, stone, and some protection from the wind. Some places were tiny. A handful of households, maybe a few families farming the same patch of land and sharing the same water source. Others were villages of dozens or hundreds of rooms built close together in long blocks of sandstone and adobe. And then there were the places that still stop people in their tracks today. Cliff dwellings, towers, great houses, enormous ceremonial rooms sunk into the ground. Roads running straight across open desert toward destinations we still debate. This was not an empty wilderness with a few isolated ruins scattered around. It was a lived-in world, a working landscape. Every field, trail, spring, storage room, rooftop, and gathering place was part of a system that had taken generations to build. Picture an ordinary settlement first. Maybe you're standing on a mesa top in what is now southwestern Colorado. Around you are fields of maize planted wherever the soil is deep enough to hold moisture. There are small masonry homes, some built partly underground, others rising above the surface. Smoke drifts from hearths. People are grinding corn, repairing tools, carrying water, shaping pottery, tending children, preparing food. Somewhere nearby, beans are climbing among the maize stalks, and squash plants spread broad leaves across the ground. That combination, maize, beans and squash, was not just a menu. It was an agricultural system. Corn provided calories. Beans added protein. Squash supplied nutrients, and with its broad leaves helped shade the soil and reduce moisture loss. In a place where rainfall could be unpredictable and a growing season could be brutally short, every advantage mattered. But nobody in the Southwest survived on farming alone. Wild plants remained essential. Piñon, nuts, seeds, berries, greens, cactus fruit, and medicinal plants could supplement a harvest or help carry people through a lean season. Deer, rabbits, turkeys, and other animals added meat when hunting was successful. Communities knew their landscapes in extraordinary detail. They knew which slope held snow longest, where rainwater gathered after a storm, which plants ripened first, and where wild game moved when the weather turned dry. And water was everything. The Four Corners region does have rivers and springs, but much of it receives too little rain and too inconsistently for farming to be simple. You could do everything right, plant at the right time, tend your crops, protect them from animals, and then watch a late frost, a failed monsoon, or a single violent storm destroy the season. So people learned to work with water wherever they could find it. They built terraces along slopes to slow runoff and prevent soil from washing away. They dug small check dams and channels. They used rock mulches, arranging stones around plants to reduce evaporation and hold moisture in the ground. They farmed near washes where floodwaters could leave behind fresh sediment, but they also understood the danger. The same water that made a field productive could rip through it in one afternoon. This was agriculture built around uncertainty, not the kind where you flip a switch and irrigation water arrives on schedule. More like a constant negotiation with weather, soil, and gravity, a system that could be remarkably productive in a good year and terrifyingly fragile in a bad one. Now scale up from one household to a village. In many places, homes gradually became more densely connected. Individual rooms were added beside older rooms, walls were rebuilt. Storage spaces multiplied. A family compound could grow into a block of apartments, and that block could become part of a pueblo, a compact settlement of connected stone rooms that might hold many families. Some buildings rose 2, 3, even 4 stories high. From the outside, they could look almost like a single enormous structure. But inside were households, workspaces, storage rooms, gathering areas, and the daily evidence of people living tightly together. These settlements changed over time. A village that began as a scattering of homes might become increasingly concentrated as families moved closer together. Sometimes that probably meant convenience, shared labour, easier access to a spring, more efficient storage. Sometimes it may have meant something more urgent. Safety. We have to be careful about assuming every clustered village was built out of fear. But later in this story, the placement of some settlements becomes impossible to ignore. And then there are the cliff dwellings. Mesa Verde is the name most people know, and for good reason. The alcoves there contain stone villages built into vast natural recesses in the canyon walls. They look almost unreal, multi-room structures rising from the rock. Doors, windows, storage spaces, ceremonial chambers, all protected beneath massive sandstone overhangs. Some were small, perhaps used by a few families. Others held dozens of rooms and could have supported substantial communities. But even here, the picture is more complicated than it first appears. Cliff dwellings were not necessarily hidden fortresses from the beginning. Some may have offered shelter from winter weather. Some sat near springs. Some were built in places with access to fields on the mesa above. And some almost certainly had ceremonial importance. Still, there is no getting around the fact that a home set deep inside a cliff alcove is easier to defend than a house exposed on an open plain. As the centuries passed, more communities began choosing locations that gave them a view, an escape route, or a barrier between themselves and anyone approaching. Then there are the towers. Across parts of the southwest, archaeologists have found round stone towers, sometimes standing alone, sometimes attached to pueblos, sometimes positioned where they overlook valleys, trails, or other settlements. They are among the most mysterious structures in the region. Were they watchtowers, places for signalling, ceremonial buildings? Storage spaces, astronomical markers? The honest answer is that they may not all have served the same purpose. A tower on a high ridge may have meant something very different from one built beside a village. But their existence tells us something important. These communities were not building randomly. They were thinking about sight lines, about movement through the landscape, about who could see whom from miles away. In a world without written maps, the built environment itself could carry information. This tower marks a place that road leads to a gathering centre. That canyon holds allies. That mesa belongs to people who have been here for generations. And at the centre of many communities were kivas. A kiva is a ceremonial chamber, usually circular, and often built partly underground. If you have only seen the ruins from above, it can be easy to miss how central these spaces were. They were not ordinary living rooms. They were places for gathering, ritual, teaching, decision-making, and maintaining relationships that held a community together. Modern Pueblo peoples have deep and varied traditions connected to ceremonial architecture, and archaeologists have to be cautious about forcing ancient structures into modern categories. But the basic point is clear. These societies invested enormous effort in spaces meant for more than eating and sleeping. Which brings us to the biggest structures of all. In Chaco Canyon, in northwestern New Mexico, people built what archaeologists call great houses. And great house barely captures the scale. Some had hundreds of rooms, multiple stories, carefully laid masonry walls, huge plazas, and oversized ceremonial chambers known as great kivas. Pueblo Bonito, the most famous of them, contained hundreds of rooms arranged in a massive D-shaped plan. It was built, expanded, altered, and maintained over generations. Just think about what that required. Stone had to be quarried and shaped. Timber had to be cut in distant mountain ranges and transported across dry country, sometimes for dozens of miles. Roof beams had to be lifted into place. Plaster had to be mixed. Food had to be produced for workers. Someone had to organize labor, coordinate construction, and preserve enough shared purpose to keep people working on projects that might not benefit any one household immediately. That does not necessarily mean Chaco was a kingdom ruled by a single all-powerful elite. Archaeologists have argued about that for decades. Some see Chaco as a regional center, with powerful leaders who controlled labor, resources, and religious authority. Others see it as a place of pilgrimage, ceremony, trade, and periodic gathering, influential because many communities chose to participate rather than because they were politically conquered. The evidence supports complexity. It does not hand us a simple organizational chart. But whatever Chaco was, it was connected. Turquoise moved through these networks. Shell from the Gulf of California and the Pacific coast appeared far from the ocean. Copper bells and macaw feathers came north from Mesoamerica. Macaws, bright red, blue, and yellow birds from tropical regions hundreds of miles away were kept at places in the southwest where they had no natural business existing. Pottery travelled, obsidian travelled, ideas travelled. Styles of architecture, ritual practices, and symbols could spread between communities that never answer to the same leader. And exchange did not only mean luxury goods, it meant relationships. If you can obtain shell from the coast, turquoise from a distant mine, or pottery made in another valley, then somebody knows somebody. Trails are being maintained, visitors are arriving. Marriages may be linking communities, gifts are being exchanged. Alliances are being renewed in difficult years. Those connections could be the difference between surviving and not surviving. This is why it is so misleading to imagine the ancestral Puebloan world as a collection of isolated settlements. Yes, communities were independent. Yes, local identities mattered. But they were also woven into larger networks that could stretch across hundreds of miles of desert, canyon, and mountain. A small farming village might have had its own fields, its own leaders, its own ceremonial calendar, and its own decisions to make. But it could still be tied to a great house in Chaco, to a pottery-producing community in another valley, to relatives living beyond the next mesa, and to trade routes reaching all the way to Mesoamerica. That network made this world resilient. A bad harvest in one place did not automatically mean disaster if neighbours could help, if stored food could move, if kinship ties opened doors somewhere else. But networks also create dependency. The more communities build their lives around exchange, shared rituals, distant alliances, and established roots, the more disruptive it becomes when those systems start to fail. And that is what was at stake. When people began leaving their homes in the late 13th century, they were not simply walking away from old buildings. They were leaving fields cleared by their grandparents, springs their families depended on, storage rooms packed with the labour of years, kivas where ceremonies had bound communities together, trade relationships that connected them to a much larger world. They were abandoning places that held memory, identity, obligation, and belonging. A village can be rebuilt, a house can be rebuilt, but a landscape of relationships built across generations is much harder to replace. So, when the settlements began to empty, the question was never just, why did they leave? The real question was, what could possibly make leaving feel like the better option? To understand why leaving became thinkable in the 1200s, we need to go back more than a century earlier, back to a place that had already shown the Southwest what it meant to build something enormous, connected and difficult to sustain. Chaco Canyon. Today it is a dry wash cutting through northwestern New Mexico. The canyon is beautiful in a severe way: high sandstone cliffs, open sky, sparse vegetation. A place where you can stand in the silence and wonder why anyone would choose to build one of the most ambitious centres in North American history there. Because Chaco was not an obvious place for a major population centre. Water was limited. Farming was possible, but risky. Timber did not grow in abundance inside the canyon. Many of the massive roof beams found in Chaco's great houses came from mountain ranges dozens of miles away. Some may have been carried more than 50 miles. No wagons, no draft animals, no metal tools. Just people moving enormous logs by hand across difficult country. And yet, beginning around the 9th century, something remarkable began to happen. Communities in and around Chaco Canyon started building on a scale the region had rarely seen before. Not just household compounds growing room by room. These were carefully planned great houses, massive stone structures with multiple stories, enormous plazas, formal layouts, and walls built with a precision that still survives after 1,000 years. Pueblo Bonito was the largest and most famous. Its rooms curved around a central plaza in a huge D-shaped form. Other complexes, including Chetro Kettle, Una Vida, Hongo Pavi, and Pueblo Alto, rose across the canyon floor and along the cliffs above it. These were not all built overnight. They expanded over generations. Rooms were added, walls were rebuilt, new spaces were created. Old ones were changed, sealed, or repurposed. But the scale was still extraordinary. A great house could contain hundreds of rooms. Some had massive ceremonial chambers, much larger than the kivas found in ordinary villages. They had broad plazas that could hold gatherings. They had storage rooms. They had carefully constructed masonry walls, sometimes several stories high. And they had an architecture that seems designed to make a statement. This place matters. The question is, what kind of statement? For decades, archaeologists have argued over what Chaco actually was. Was it the capital of a regional political system, controlled by powerful elites who could direct labour and demand tribute from surrounding communities? Was it a religious centre, drawing pilgrims for ceremonies, feasts, and seasonal gatherings? Was it a network of influential households connected by trade, kinship, ritual, and shared identity, rather than a single government? Or was it some combination of all of those things, changing over time as Chaco itself grew more powerful? The evidence does not give us a simple answer. Some burials, especially inside Pueblo Bonito, contained rare goods and suggest that certain people held unusual status. Archaeologists have found turquoise, shell-carved ornaments and the remains of macaws brought from far to the south. These were not everyday possessions. They point to wealth, long-distance connections, and possibly a restricted religious or political class. But a great house does not automatically equal a palace. Hundreds of rooms do not automatically mean hundreds of permanent residents. Some Chacoan buildings may have housed many people. Others may have been used seasonally, ceremonially, or as places for storing goods and hosting visitors. A room can be a home. It can also be a storeroom, a ritual space, a guest chamber, or a place opened only during certain times of year. That uncertainty is important. Chaco was clearly influential. It was clearly monumental, but influence does not always work through armies and kings. Sometimes it works through ceremony, through prestige, through the ability to bring distant communities together and make participation feel necessary. And Chaco had ways of reaching far beyond the canyon. Across the landscape, archaeologists have identified broad, remarkably straight road segments associated with the Chacoan world. Some are wide enough to suggest coordinated construction. They run over ridges across open desert and toward outlying great houses in distant communities. In some places they seem to connect settlements. In others they lead toward shrines, landmarks, or places that do not look like ordinary destinations at all. Were these roads used to move timber, food, pottery, and people? Almost certainly, at least in part. Were they ceremonial pathways, routes used during pilgrimages or processions? Many researchers think that is possible. Were they tools of political control, marking a regional system centered on Chaco? Maybe, but that is harder to prove. The roads are one of those pieces of evidence that make Chaco feel both familiar and alien. We recognize infrastructure. We recognize the effort required to build it. But we do not fully know what people believed happened when they walked those roads. We do not know whether they carried offerings, food, messages, raw materials, or stories. Maybe all of it. What we do know is that Chaco was not isolated. It sat at the center of a world in motion. Turquoise moved through the region in huge quantities. Shell came from the Pacific coast and the Gulf of California. Copper bells arrived from far to the south, probably through exchange networks linked to Mesoamerica. Macaws arrived alive, then were kept and used in ceremonies long after they died. Pottery styles spread, architectural forms spread, religious symbols spread. People themselves moved through this landscape, carrying marriages, obligations, knowledge, and alliances from one community to another. Think about the kind of system that creates that. A farmer in a small village might never travel to the coast. They might never see the mountain where a roof beam was cut. They might never meet the person who raised a macaw hundreds of miles south. But the objects reached them. The stories reached them. The rituals connected to those objects may have reached them too. That is how a regional world becomes larger than any one settlement. And for a time, Chaco seems to have been one of the places holding that world together. Its peak came roughly between the late 900s and the early 1100s. Great houses were enlarged, construction intensified, connections with distant communities became more visible in the archaeological record. Outlying sites adopted Chacoan-style architecture. Communities built great houses and great kivas far beyond the canyon itself. Whether those places were colonies, allied centres, pilgrimage stations, or local communities borrowing a powerful style is still debated. But they show that Chaco's influence was real. Then, after the 1100s, the pattern changed. Construction inside Chaco Canyon slowed. Some great houses were no longer maintained in the same way. The flow of certain imported goods declined. Evidence suggests that parts of the canyon had become harder to support. A major drought beginning around 1130 lasted for decades, placing intense pressure on agriculture and water supplies. In a place already living close to environmental limits, that mattered. But calling this a collapse can be misleading. Chaco did not simply switch off. Its people did not disappear. Its ideas did not vanish into the dust. What seems to have happened was more complicated, a transformation. Some communities moved away from the canyon, some connections weakened. Other centres gained importance. The geography of power, ceremony, and exchange began to shift. It is possible that the Chaco system had become too expensive to maintain. Monumental building requires labour. Labour requires food. Food requires reliable harvests, stored surplus, or support from surrounding communities. If drought reduced harvests year after year, every part of that system would have been strained. But climate alone cannot explain the change. Drought had happened before. People had adapted before. The deeper question is whether Chaco's social arrangements, whatever they were, had become less workable under pressure. Maybe distant communities no longer saw the same benefit in sending labour or goods. Maybe local leaders challenged the old order. Maybe ceremonies that once united people no longer carried the same authority. Maybe people simply chose to invest in smaller, more flexible communities closer to dependable land and water. We cannot know exactly which of those forces mattered most. What we can say is that after Chaco's peak, the Southwest did not become empty. It reorganized. People carried Chacoan traditions with them. Great kivas continued to be built in some regions. Road systems and travel routes remained meaningful. Pottery designs changed, but pottery continued to move. Turquoise and shell still circulated. Communities continued to gather, trade, intermarry, and share ceremonial practices across long distances. The centre had changed. The network had not disappeared. That matters because the crisis of the late 1200s did not strike a world that had been stable for centuries. It struck a world already shaped by memory of earlier upheaval, a world in which communities had seen major centres rise, transform, and lose their pull. A world where people already understood that landscapes could become unreliable, alliances could shift, and survival might require moving somewhere new. By the time Mesa Verde and other northern settlements began to empty, people were not facing the idea of migration for the first time. Their grandparents and great-grandparents may have inherited stories of Chaco, of distant great houses, of roads across the desert, of communities changing course when old arrangements no longer worked. And that is the key. The later exodus was not one isolated disaster falling on one isolated people. It was the latest and most dramatic chapter in a much longer history of movement, adaptation, connection and transformation across the ancient Southwest. If Chaco showed what it meant to build a regional centre, Mesa Verde showed what it meant to build a homeland into the landscape itself. Mesa Verde sits in what is now southwestern Colorado, a vast high plateau cut through by deep sandstone canyons. The name means green table, and from a distance that is what it looks like. A broad forested mesa rising above dry country. But walk closer and the land changes. The flat top breaks apart into fingers of stone. Canyons open beneath you. Seasonal streams cut through shaded alcoves. Beneath overhanging cliffs, hidden from the open sky, are some of the most extraordinary communities ever built in North America. Cliff Palace, longhouse, balcony house. Names given much later, of course. The people who lived there had their own names, their own stories, their own ways of understanding these places. But even today, the scale is hard to take in. Cliff Palace contains more than 150 rooms and over 20 kivas. Long House stretches beneath a huge sandstone alcove, with clusters of rooms, storage spaces, plazas, and ceremonial chambers built into the sheltered ledge. Balcony House is smaller and more compact, but its placement feels almost impossible. It sits high in a narrow alcove, reachable through routes that would have been easy to control. These places look like fortresses to modern eyes, and maybe, at least in part, they were. But they were not built as empty monuments. They were homes. Picture a morning in one of these alcoves during the late 1200s. Smoke rising from hearths, corn being ground on stone slabs, children moving between rooms, pottery vessels filled with water, beans, squash, seeds and stored grain, people climbing ladders between roof levels, elders gathering in the shade, families tending fields on the mesa above, then returning to stone rooms tucked beneath the cliff. The cliff dwellings were not separate from daily life. They were daily life, cooking, storage, childcare, tool-making, ceremony, argument, marriage, mourning, planning for the next harvest, and that is what makes what happened afterwards so haunting. Because in the space of only a few generations, many of these homes were left behind. But before we get to that, we need to be careful about one major misconception. Not everyone at Mesa Verde lived in a cliff dwelling. In fact, for much of the region's history, people lived primarily on the mesa tops. They built villages near fields, springs and travel routes. Some lived in small household clusters, others lived in larger pueblos with connected rooms, kivas, storage areas and open plazas. The famous alcove settlements were only one part of a much larger landscape. Across the mesa tops, archaeologists have found the remains of farmsteads, hamlets, field houses, reservoirs, check dams, shrines, roads and villages. The people of Mesa Verde did not all gather beneath cliffs at one moment and abandon their older homes forever. Settlement patterns shifted over time. Some communities remained on the mesa tops. Some built or expanded cliff dwellings. Some may have moved back and forth seasonally, using different places for different needs. This was not one city. It was a dense and complicated world of communities spread across a difficult landscape. For centuries, that landscape had supported farming. Families grew maize, beans and squash. Corn was the foundation of the food system, but it was never enough by itself. People gathered wild plants, hunted deer and smaller animals, collected wood, managed water, and stored food against bad years. Every household had to think ahead. One failed harvest was dangerous. Two could be devastating. A long run of poor seasons could force impossible decisions. Where do we plant next year? What do we eat through winter? Who gets the stored corn? Who leaves? At Mesa Verde's height, communities were trying to answer those questions while population was growing and usable land was becoming increasingly valuable. The shift into the cliff alcoves during the 1200s was one of the most dramatic responses to this changing world. For generations, people had used alcoves for storage, temporary shelter, ritual activity, and small structures. But in the 13th century, building intensified. More rooms appeared beneath the cliffs, more villages became concentrated in sheltered canyon walls. Existing structures were enlarged. New complexes were built with carefully fitted sandstone masonry, plastered walls, and multiple levels connected by ladders and rooftops. This was skilled construction. The builders understood stone. They understood how to use the natural shelter of the alcove, how to place walls where they would be protected from rain and snow, how to build storage rooms in cool shaded spaces, how to create plazas and kivas in places that seemed almost suspended between earth and sky. And the location offered real advantages. Defense was one of them. Many cliff dwellings were not impossible to reach. People needed access to fields, water, wood, and neighbouring communities. But some were positioned in narrow alcoves with limited approaches. A path could be watched, an entrance could be controlled, a ladder could be pulled up in a time of tension that mattered. We should not assume every high or hidden settlement was built because people were under attack. Cliffs also offered shade, shelter, storage space, and proximity to water sources in canyon bottoms. But the defensive qualities were real, and the timing is difficult to ignore. As more people moved into these protected locations, evidence from other parts of the northern southwest suggests that competition and violence may have been increasing. Then there was food security. Corn was life. It could be dried, stored, carried, and saved for lean times. But storage only helps if you have surplus to store, and surplus depends on rainfall. Cliff alcoves could provide dry, protected rooms where food might last longer than it would in exposed structures on the mesa top. In a world where one season could determine whether a family survived the next, a secure storage room was not just a convenience. It was a buffer between abundance and hunger. Water mattered too. Mesa Verde was never an easy place to farm. Rainfall was unpredictable. Springs could weaken. Seasonal runoff could vanish. Yet canyon environments sometimes held water longer than exposed mesa tops. Seeps emerged from sandstone. Small springs collected beneath cliffs. Shaded alcoves reduced evaporation. Access was still limited, and carrying water was hard work. But in dry years, even a modest, reliable source could become enormously important. Then there was ritual. The kivas in Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings tell us these were not merely shelters built in panic. A kiva was a ceremonial space, often circular or square, and partially underground or built to evoke an underground chamber. It was a place of gathering, a place where communities renewed obligations, marked seasonal cycles, taught knowledge, and connected themselves to ancestors and sacred histories. At Cliff Palace, the number of kivas is striking. More than 20 ceremonial spaces in one complex. That does not necessarily mean 20 separate religious groups. But it does suggest a community organized around repeated gathering, shared ritual, and perhaps multiple households maintaining their own traditions within a larger settlement. Think about what that means. As life became more uncertain, people were not only building walls, they were building places to remain a community. That may be one reason the cliff dwellings feel so powerful. They are not just defensive architecture, they are social architecture. Rooms pressed together, shared plazas, shared storage, shared ceremonial spaces. Families living close enough to hear each other, depend on each other, and perhaps watch each other. That closeness could create security. It could also create pressure. More people in one place means more labour available for construction, food production, defence, and ritual. But it also means more mouths to feed, more demand for wood, more strain on nearby fields, more disagreements over water, land, marriage, leadership, and stored food. The same settlement pattern that made survival possible in a dangerous period may also have made communities more vulnerable when conditions got worse. And there is another mystery here. The cliff dwellings were not crude last-minute shelters. Some were built with remarkable care during the very decades before Mesa Verde was largely depopulated. Stone walls were raised, rooms were plastered, kivas were maintained. Storage spaces were created. Families invested labour that must have taken years to organise. They were building for a future. That is the part we have to sit with. People do not haul stone, shape masonry, build roofs, and create ceremonial rooms because they expect to leave tomorrow. They do it because they believe this place can sustain their children. They do it because they are committing themselves to a landscape. And yet, by the end of the 1200s, that commitment had broken. The alcoves that had offered shelter, storage, water, ritual space, and perhaps safety from enemies were abandoned. Not necessarily on one single day, not necessarily by every household at the same time, but across Mesa Verde and much of the northern southwest, the pattern is unmistakable. Communities that had invested so heavily in these places stopped maintaining them. The question is not simply why they left. The question is why they built so intensely, so late, and then found that even these extraordinary homes were not enough to make them stay. But what does, by the end of the 1200s, actually mean? Did every family wake up one morning, look at the same empty fields, pack the same belongings, and walk away from Mesa Verde together? No, the evidence does not support one single day of abandonment. There was no final bell, no universal order, no moment when every hearth went cold at once. But that does not make the story less dramatic, because when archaeologists map the timing as carefully as they can, they see something extraordinary. Across much of the Mesa Verde region, villages that had been occupied for generations begin to empty within a relatively narrow window of time. Not in hours, not in weeks, but across years and decades, especially during the late 1200s. And by around 1300, a landscape that had supported thousands of people was, in many areas, largely without the communities that had built it. To understand how we know that, we have to understand how archaeologists tell time, when nobody left behind a calendar. The most precise tool is wood. The ancestral Puebloans built with timber. They used beams for roofs, ladders, floors, and supports. When those beams survive, they can preserve a record of the year they were cut. Trees grow rings. In a wet year, the ring may be wider. In a dry year, narrower. Across the southwest, tree ring specialists have built long sequences by matching patterns from living trees, dead wood, and ancient construction beams. It is like fitting together thousands of wooden barcodes. A beam from a cliff dwelling can sometimes be dated to the exact year the tree was cut. If the outermost ring is still present, archaeologists may know not just that a room was built in the late 1200s, but that its roof timber was cut in 1274, or 1281, or 1287. That is an astonishing level of precision for a world more than 7 centuries ago. But a cutting date is not exactly the same thing as an occupation date. A tree cut in 1274 tells us that someone was building, repairing, or expanding a structure then. It does not tell us precisely when the last family left. A roof beam might remain in place for years after a room was abandoned. A family might move away, another family might move in, and a building might be repaired more than once. Wood gives us anchors in time. It does not give us a complete diary. So archaeologists combine it with other evidence. Pottery is one of the biggest clues. Styles changed over time. Shapes, painted designs, surface treatments, and manufacturing techniques can often be placed within broad date ranges. A bowl with a particular black-on-white pattern may point to one generation. A corrugated cooking jar may suggest another. Pottery cannot usually tell us that a household left in the autumn of a specific year, but across hundreds of sites it can show when communities were still actively using, making, trading, and discarding particular kinds of vessels. Then there is architecture. New rooms tend to be built in recognizable ways. Masonry styles shift, kivas are remodeled, plazas are enclosed. Storage rooms are added, doors are sealed, structures collapse and are not rebuilt. A village with fresh construction, repaired walls, and late pottery looks different from a village where roofs have fallen. Rooms were stripped of usable materials and no later buildings appear. And then there are settlement surveys. This is where the scale of the story becomes visible. Archaeologists do not study only famous places like Cliff Palace. They walk mesa tops, canyon rims, dry washes, field edges, and remote alcoves. They record small farmsteads, isolated storage rooms, abandoned hamlets, large pueblos, shrines, roads, reservoirs, and artifact scatters. When those sites are plotted across the landscape and dated as closely as possible, a regional pattern emerges. During the 13th century, settlement becomes more concentrated in certain places. Then, late in the century, many of those places stop showing signs of continued occupation. Not every site, not every valley, not every household, but enough that the pattern cannot be explained by a few families relocating down the road. In the Mesa Verde region, many communities seem to have been leaving through the 1270s, 1280s, and 1290s. Some settlements may have emptied earlier, others held on longer. A few places may have remained occupied into the early 1300s. Archaeology is rarely neat enough to give us a single final date for an entire region. Still, the broad result is hard to escape. By around 1300, the northern San Juan region, including much of Mesa Verde country, had undergone a massive depopulation. And that word matters. Depopulation, not disappearance. The people did not vanish into thin air. They did not become a lost civilization. They moved. Some communities in the northern southwest were abandoned or dramatically reduced. But other areas remained occupied. Some places appear to have absorbed newcomers. Settlement grew in regions to the south and east, including parts of the Rio Grande Valley and the Zuni and Cibola areas. Communities on the Hopi Mesas also remained important centers of Pueblo life. Archaeologists see signs of population movement in changing pottery traditions, new architectural forms, expanded villages and communities becoming larger and more diverse. That does not mean every Mesa Verde family went to the same destination. They almost certainly did not. Think of it less like one evacuation route and more like a river splitting into channels. One group may have joined relatives farther south. Another may have moved east toward the Rio Grande. Another may have travelled west. Some may have merged into existing villages. Some may have founded new ones with people from several different regions. Migration was not the end of a society. It was a reorganization of one. And it probably did not feel like a clean break while it was happening. A family leaves a failing field one year, hoping conditions improve. Another stays because grandparents are buried nearby, because their kiva still matters, because they have stores left, because moving is dangerous. A neighbouring village empties. Trade partners stop arriving. A marriage alliance pulls people toward another valley. Then another dry year comes, another raid perhaps, another crop failure, another household leaves. Over time, the decision to stay becomes harder to defend. That is why the phrase "everyone left at once" is wrong in the literal sense, but emotionally understandable. From the perspective of history, the change was incredibly fast. For centuries, Mesa Verde had been filled with farms, villages, towers, kivas, roads and homes beneath the cliffs. Then, within perhaps a few decades, much of that intensely occupied landscape was transformed. Roofs were no longer repaired. Fields were no longer planted in the same way. Springs and pathways remained, but the communities that had organized life around them were gone. Not all at once, but fast enough that the silence must have felt sudden. So what made staying harder? One answer is written in the trees. Across the southwest, tree ring records preserve a climate history far older than any written document. Year by year, narrow rings record seasons when trees struggled for water. Wider rings mark years when moisture was more abundant. And in the late 13th century, those records show something deeply troubling: a long period of drought. Archaeologists and climate researchers often call it the Great Drought of 1276 to 1299. For more than 2 decades, much of the Colorado Plateau and the northern southwest experienced reduced rainfall. Not necessarily 23 straight years without a drop of rain. Drought does not work like that. Some summers may have brought storms. Some valleys may have done better than others. But the overall pattern was dry enough, long enough, and widespread enough to put enormous pressure on communities already living close to the edge. And to understand why, you have to picture how food was produced in Mesa Verde country. This was not a land of broad rivers and endlessly irrigated fields. Most farmers relied heavily on rainfall. They planted maize in dryland fields, using knowledge built over generations. They chose soils that held moisture. They farmed near runoff channels and low places where water collected. They built check dams, terraces, and small water control features to slow erosion and capture precious soil. They planted beans and squash alongside corn. They stored food for the future. They knew this landscape intimately, but no amount of skill can guarantee a harvest when the rains fail often enough. Maize is hardy in the right conditions. It can grow in places that seem almost impossibly dry to modern eyes. But it still needs moisture at the right time. Rain too early, and much of it disappears before the plants need it. Rain too late, and the crop may never mature. A dry spring can prevent seeds from establishing. A dry summer can leave stalks short and ears underdeveloped. An early frost after a poor growing season can finish what drought began. One bad harvest is a crisis. 2 bad harvests can be survived if the storage rooms are full, if neighbours can share, if hunters bring in game, if kin in another valley had better rainfall. But what happens when poor harvests repeat? At first, families open their stored corn. Every household would have understood the importance of storage. Corn was not just food for today, it was security. It was winter survival. It was seed for next year. It was the difference between a difficult season and disaster. Granaries and storage rooms were, in a very real sense, time machines. They allowed a successful harvest to feed people months later, even years later. But stored food runs out, and when it does, every other source of support becomes more important. Beans, squash, gathered plants, pinyon nuts, wild seeds, rabbits, deer. Turkeys may have provided meat, feathers, and another form of household wealth. Trade partners might provide food from a better watered region. Relatives might take in a struggling family. Except drought does not affect only corn. Dry years can reduce wild plant foods. They can shrink the forage available to deer and other game. Springs become less reliable. Waterholes dry up. Animals move farther away or become harder to find. The same landscape that once offered a buffer against crop failure begins failing in multiple ways at once. And then there is the next planting season. A family that eats all its stored corn faces a terrible choice. Keep some kernels as seed and let people go hungry now. Or eat the seed and risk having nothing to plant when the rains finally return. That is the kind of decision drought can force on a household. Not one dramatic catastrophe, but a tightening sequence of smaller disasters. A thin harvest, empty storage jars, a harder winter, fewer animals nearby, more time spent gathering food. Less seed available, more debt or dependence on neighbours. Another year when the clouds fail to arrive. Over time, the question changes. It is no longer, can we survive this dry year? It becomes, can we survive here? That may help explain why so many communities in the Mesa Verde region began to empty during the same broad period. The Great Drought was real, the timing is real, and it overlaps strikingly with the late 13th century depopulation of the northern San Juan region. But here is the problem. Drought is a powerful explanation. It is not a complete explanation, because if drought alone caused people to leave, we might expect a simple pattern. Dry region abandoned, wetter region occupied. Everyone moves directly toward water. That is not what the archaeological record shows. The Great Drought affected a vast area, but it did not affect every place equally. Rainfall in the southwest is famously patchy. One valley can receive enough summer storms to produce a modest crop, while another, not far away, gets almost nothing. Elevation matters, soil matters, access to runoff matters. A spring that remains dependable can make one settlement viable while a neighbouring settlement struggles. And even when conditions were bad across a broad region, people did not abandon every place in the same way. Some communities left early, some stayed through much of the drought. Some regions in the southwest remained occupied. Others grew as newcomers arrived. The Rio Grande Valley, the Zuni and Cibola areas, and the Hopi Mesas were not simply untouched, refuges where food appeared effortlessly. They had their own environmental limits, their own histories, and their own communities. Yet they remained places where Pueblo people could build or expand settlements, while the Mesa Verde region was losing population. That tells us something important. People were not just fleeing dry weather. They were making choices within networks of family, farming knowledge, political relationships, ritual obligations, and access to land. A place with slightly better rainfall might still be unavailable if another community already controlled the fields. A distant village might be more attractive than a nearby one if relatives lived there. A place with reliable water could also be dangerous, crowded, or contested. Drought may have made the old life unsustainable, but it did not tell people where to go. And it did not determine who would leave first, who would hold on, or who would be welcomed somewhere else. In fact, the pressure of drought may have exposed a deeper problem. Mesa Verde country had supported a large population for generations. Fields had been planted, trees cut for construction and fuel, game hunted, water sources relied upon, and the best farmland claimed. When the climate turned against them, there may have been less room for error than there had once been. The drought did not create every weakness, it may simply have revealed them. And that raises the next question. How many people were trying to survive in this landscape when the drought arrived? We do not have a census. Nobody was walking through Mesa Verde country in 1250, knocking on doors and counting households. But archaeology gives us clues: more houses, more villages, more storage rooms, more fields, more pottery scattered across the landscape, more places where people were building, farming, gathering water, raising children, and burying their dead. In parts of the northern southwest, the centuries before the final exodus appear to have been periods of substantial population growth. The land that had once held scattered farmsteads became crowded with communities. Small villages multiplied. Then, in some places, people began gathering into larger settlements. Mesa tops that had supported a few households now held clusters of rooms. Canyons that once contained isolated homes saw the construction of dense cliff dwellings. Across the northern San Juan region, families were making use of almost every workable corner of the landscape. At first, that growth could have been a sign of success. More people means more children surviving, more harvests producing enough surplus to support larger households, more labour to build houses, clear fields, repair terraces, and maintain water control features. A growing community has more hands to plant corn and more people to call on when a roof collapses, a field washes out, or a family suffers a bad season. But population growth changes the equation. because the landscape does not grow with the population. There is only so much arable land, and in Mesa Verde country, not all land was equal. A patch of soil might look promising after a summer rain, green for a few weeks, rich enough to grow maize in a good year. But could it hold enough moisture through a dry spring? Was it deep enough for roots? Did it sit in a frost pocket? Would runoff carve through it during a violent storm? Was it close enough to a home that farmers could guard it from animals and tend it every day? The best fields were valuable. They were probably known, remembered, inherited, and fiercely important. As populations expanded, families may have been pushed onto less reliable land. Fields farther from water, soils that were thinner, rockier, or more exposed. Areas with shorter growing seasons, places that could produce corn when rainfall was generous, but failed quickly when conditions turned dry. That is the danger of farming at the margins. In a good year, marginal land can make expansion look sustainable. A few wet seasons arrive, crops grow in places that had seemed too risky. New households settle nearby, more mouths can be fed. More fields are opened, then the rains fail, and those marginal fields are often the first to fail with them. The people farming the deepest soils near dependable runoff may still manage a reduced harvest. But households depending on the outer edge of the agricultural system could lose almost everything. Not because they were careless, not because they lacked knowledge. Quite the opposite. They were skilled farmers operating in a difficult environment, but skill has limits when the basic margin of safety disappears. And fields were only part of the problem. People needed timber. Pinyon and juniper provided fuel. Larger trees, especially straight conifers from higher elevations, were needed for roof beams and construction. Building a room block, a kiva, or a cliff dwelling required labour, planning, and wood gathered from somewhere. Tree ring studies show that some large construction timbers used in Chaco and other Puebloan centres came from considerable distances. That does not prove every community had exhausted its local forests. But it does reveal something important. Timber was not always close at hand. As nearby woodlands were cut for roofs, fuel, and daily life, people may have had to travel farther for usable trees. Longer trips mean more labour. More labour means less time for farming, gathering, hunting, maintaining buildings, or caring for children. During prosperous years, that burden could be absorbed. During drought, when every household was already working harder for less food, it could become another pressure point. Then there was game. Deer, rabbits, birds, and other animals were never a replacement for a successful corn harvest. But they mattered. Wild food could help households survive a lean season. Yet game populations depend on the same ecological system humans depend on. Drought reduces forage. More people hunting the same territory reduces animal numbers. Wood cutting and field expansion can alter habitat. The farther hunters had to travel, the more effort each meal required. Water, of course, was the resource beneath all the others. A spring that ran through dry months was not just convenient. It was life, a seep, a reservoir, a reliable catchment basin, a canyon pool after seasonal rains. These places could shape where people settled and which communities could endure. But reliable water sources are limited, and when many households depend on the same spring, water becomes more than an environmental fact. It becomes a social relationship. Who gets access? Who maintains the source? Who has rights to nearby fields? Who arrives later and asks to share? These are questions archaeology cannot answer directly. We do not have transcripts of village meetings, but we know that people were not isolated households drifting through an empty wilderness. They lived in communities with obligations, kinship ties, ritual responsibilities, and probably deeply held ideas about land and belonging. That matters because environmental pressure does not mechanically produce one outcome. Drought does not press a button and make people abandon a village. A poor harvest might lead one family to borrow food from relatives. Another might move temporarily to a better watered community. A village might reorganize labor, plant different fields, reduce construction, or rely more heavily on trade. Leaders or ceremonial institutions may have helped coordinate food storage and mutual aid. Or perhaps they failed to do so in ways people found acceptable. The evidence allows several possibilities. Some researchers have suggested that long-term farming may have contributed to erosion and soil loss in heavily used areas. Once vegetation is reduced, rain does not always soak gently into the ground. It can rush down slope, carrying away precious topsoil. Fields can become less productive. Check dams and terraces can help, but they require constant maintenance. A single intense storm can damage years of work. Other scholars caution against imagining a simple story of ecological collapse caused by overuse. Pueblo farmers had managed dry landscapes for centuries. They understood runoff, soil, plant cycles, and local variation at a level few outsiders ever could. The archaeological record shows adaptation as well as stress. People shifted fields, moved settlements, built water control features, and made decisions based on changing conditions. Still, even the best management cannot create deep soil where little remains. It cannot make a failing spring flow. It cannot guarantee game will return. And it cannot erase the conflicts that can emerge when too many people need the same limited resources. That may be the key. Population pressure was not just about numbers. It was about the relationship between people, land, water, and trust. As conditions worsened, every resource became more charged. A productive field was no longer simply a field. It was the difference between security and hunger. A stand of timber was not just building material. It was warmth in winter and a roof over a family. A spring was not merely water. It was survival, and access to it could define who belonged. Under those conditions, old alliances could be tested. Newcomers could become burdens. Disputes that had once been manageable could become dangerous. And in the years before the cities went quiet, the archaeological record suggests that danger may have been growing. Danger may have been growing, and one of the most unsettling clues is where some people chose to live. Look at the great cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. Rooms stacked beneath overhanging sandstone. Houses tucked into alcoves high above canyon floors. Narrow trails winding along ledges. Entrances that could be watched. Places that were sheltered from wind and weather, yes. But also places that were not easy to reach. A family living in an open mesa-top village could step outside and see the sky in every direction. A family living deep inside a cliff alcove had something else. Stone walls around them, limited approaches, and a position that gave them a view of anyone coming through the canyon. That does not automatically mean they were under attack. Cliff alcoves offered practical advantages. They were protected from rain and snow. Their south-facing walls could be warmer in winter. Nearby seeps might provide water. The sandstone itself supplied building material, while the mesa above could still provide fields. But location is rarely just one thing. A place can be practical and defensible at the same time. And by the late 13th century, some settlements across the northern southwest seemed to show increasing concern with defense. Villages were built on high mesas, behind narrow access points, or in locations where approach was restricted by cliffs, boulders, and steep terrain. At some sites, entrances appear limited. Towers stand near edges and approaches. Walls and room blocks create boundaries between the inside of a community and the landscape beyond it. Imagine what that means in daily life. You do not build every village like a fortress. Not unless the outside world has started to feel less predictable. A tower might have had many purposes. It could have been a storage space, a ceremonial structure, a landmark, a place to observe fields, watch weather, or signal to nearby communities. Archaeology cannot simply point to a tower and say, this was a watchtower, this was built for war. But when towers, walls, restricted paths, and defensible locations begin appearing alongside evidence of environmental stress, researchers have to ask the question, were people afraid? The answer may be yes, at least some of the time. There is direct evidence that violence occurred in the centuries surrounding the Great Migrations. Human remains at some sites show trauma, skull injuries, broken bones, projectile wounds, and other damage that may have come from violent encounters. Some settlements were burned, some buildings contain signs of destruction. In a few cases, bodies appear to have been left in ways that suggest a community was overwhelmed, disrupted, or unable to carry out ordinary burial practices. These are not imaginary dangers. Violence was real. But this is where the story becomes difficult, because bones do not come with eyewitness accounts. A fracture can result from an assault. It can also come from a fall, an accident, or hard physical work. A burned room may have been set on fire by attackers. It might also have burned accidentally or been intentionally burned by its own residents during a ritual closing or planned departure. A body not buried in the usual way might indicate massacre, but it could also reflect disease, sudden flight, scavenging, or later disturbance. Archaeologists have to build their interpretations from fragments. A projectile point embedded in bone is powerful evidence. A burned settlement with trauma victims is more compelling than either clue alone, but even then, the larger story remains uncertain. Who attacked? Why? Was it an organized raid? A local feud? Retaliation after a dispute over land, water, food, or access to a spring? Were outsiders involved? Or were these conflicts happening between communities that had once traded, intermarried, and shared ceremonies? The evidence can tell us violence happened. It usually cannot tell us the whole argument that came before it. And that matters, because it is tempting to turn this period into a simple story. Drought arrives, food runs out, desperate people become violent, villages burn, everyone flees. Real human history is rarely that neat. Drought can increase pressure, hunger can make disputes harder to resolve. Competition over productive fields, stored corn, timber, water, or hunting territory could sharpen old tensions. A community that might welcome newcomers in a good year may see them differently after several failed harvests. A family seeking food could be seen as neighbours in need, or as a threat to a settlement already struggling to feed itself. But pressure does not make violence inevitable. People can also cooperate under stress. They can share food, exchange marriage partners, move in with relatives, form alliances, and create new rules for managing scarce resources. In fact, the very existence of large communities suggests people were often capable of extraordinary coordination. The question is not whether every village became violent. The question is whether the balance between cooperation and conflict was changing. In some areas, perhaps it was. Raiding is one possibility. Small-scale attacks do not require armies or kingdoms. A raid can be carried out by a handful of people moving quickly, taking food, tools, captives, or stored supplies, then disappearing into difficult terrain. In a world of scattered settlements, narrow canyons, and seasonal movement, raiding could be hard to prevent, and even harder to trace thousands of years later. Local feuds are another possibility, a dispute over a field boundary, access to a spring, a marriage alliance that broke down, an accusation, an insult, a killing that demanded a response. We cannot reconstruct these events in detail, but societies do not need to be collapsing into total war for violence to become a serious force in people's decisions. Sometimes the threat of attack changes behavior even if an attack never comes. You move closer to relatives. You choose a home with one narrow entrance instead of an open hillside. You build where the approach can be seen. You keep more people together at night. You leave a place that no longer feels safe. That may help explain why some late settlements seem more concentrated and more defensible than earlier communities. People may have been seeking protection in numbers. A larger village could pool labour, share food, organise watches, and respond more effectively to danger. But concentrating people also created new vulnerabilities. More mouths to feed, more competition inside the settlement, more pressure on nearby fields and water. Safety itself could become another scarce resource. Still, we need to be careful. The archaeological record is not a map of universal terror. Many sites show no clear evidence of attack. Many communities may have relocated peacefully through planned migration and existing ties to other villages. Some cliff dwellings could reflect tradition, convenience, local geography, or social identity more than fear. And even where violence occurred, it may have been episodic rather than constant. A burned village can dominate our imagination because fire leaves dramatic evidence. A skull wound is unforgettable, but ordinary life leaves quieter traces. Grinding stones, storage jars, hearths, repaired walls, children growing up, people planting corn and gathering firewood. Those things continued too. The people of Mesa Verde country were not simply victims waiting for disaster. They were farmers, builders, traders, parents, ritual leaders, craftspeople, and neighbours. They made choices under pressures we can only partly understand. But by the late 1200s, some of those choices seem to have been shaped by insecurity. Not everywhere, not for everyone, not in one single dramatic moment. Yet enough signs appear: defensible locations, restricted access, towers, trauma, burned structures that conflict cannot be ignored. The trouble is, once archaeologists agree that violence happened, a harder disagreement begins. How much did it matter? Was conflict one pressure among many? Or was it a central force pushing communities to abandon landscapes their ancestors had occupied for generations? That is where the evidence starts to divide. And that divide is not just about one site, one burned room, or one set of bones. It goes to the heart of the entire mystery. Why did so many ancestral Pueblo communities leave the Four Corners region during the late 13th century? Ask 5 archaeologists, and you may get 5 different answers. One points to drought, another points to violence. Another sees a deeper political crisis, the breakdown of alliances and institutions that had once held far-flung communities together. Another argues that religious change transformed the meaning of the old places. And another asks whether we are framing the question wrong from the beginning. Maybe people did not simply flee. Maybe they migrated deliberately, in stages toward places where relatives, allies, and new opportunities already existed. The evidence for each possibility is real. That is what makes this so difficult. The drought evidence is hard to ignore. Tree rings record years of reduced rainfall. Corn agriculture in this region depended on narrow margins, enough summer rain, enough winter moisture, enough stored food to survive the bad years. When drought stretched from one season into another, the consequences could cascade. Poor harvests, empty storage rooms, more labour required to gather water, firewood, and wild foods. Families forced to make decisions they might never have considered in a good year. But drought alone does not explain everything. Drought had happened before. The Southwest had always been a land of uncertainty, where rain could arrive late, fall unevenly, or fail completely. Communities had survived earlier dry periods by moving fields, relying on stored food, gathering wild plants, hunting, trading, and leaning on kin networks. So the question becomes, what made this drought different? Perhaps the landscape was already under strain. More people were relying on the same fields, the same forests, the same springs. Years of cutting timber, gathering fuel, farming marginal land, and feeding growing communities may have reduced the room people had to adapt. A drought that would have been survivable for a scattered population could become devastating for a crowded one. Think of it like a bridge. A bridge can hold weight for years. Then one more truck drives across, and suddenly it fails. The truck was real, but it was not the only reason the bridge collapsed. The supports had been weakening long before it arrived. That is how some archaeologists see climate stress in the late 1200s. Not as a single killer, but as the pressure that exposed every weakness already built into the system. Then there is violence. The defensive locations, the restricted access routes, the burned structures, the injuries found on some human remains. These clues suggest that at least some communities faced real danger from other people. Drought and food shortages could have made that danger worse. Competition over productive land, water sources, stored corn, and access to trade routes may have turned tense relationships into open conflict. But even here, the evidence resists a simple conclusion. Not every settlement was attacked. Not every abandoned village was burned. And not every person living in a defensible place was hiding from enemies. The same cliff alcove that gave protection from raiders also offered shelter from snow, wind, and rain. The same tower that might watch an approach could also serve ritual, storage, communication, or community identity. Archaeology deals in traces. It can reveal what people built, what they ate, where they moved, which rooms they sealed, which structures they burned, and sometimes how they died. But it almost never gives us a written explanation. No letter survives saying, "We left because the rains failed." No council record tells us, "Our alliance collapsed." No village leader carved into stone, "We are moving south because our neighbours can no longer be trusted." Instead, archaeologists have pottery fragments, tree rings, bones, hearths, field systems, pollen samples, wall foundations, and the silent geography of abandoned homes. And from those fragments, they have to reconstruct human decisions. If you are enjoying this kind of mystery, our book on 12 unexplained mysteries goes much deeper into stories that still divide researchers. You can find it on our website through the link in the description. Now, one of the most important possibilities is that the crisis was not only environmental or military. It may have been political, not political in the modern sense, with presidents, borders, and written laws, but political in the sense that communities depend on agreements. Who has access to land? Who can draw water from a spring? Which villages exchange goods? Which families marry into which communities? Who organizes ceremonies? Who settles disputes when tensions rise? For centuries, ancestral Pueblo societies had maintained networks across enormous distances. Pottery, shell, turquoise, obsidian, parrots, and other materials moved between communities. Ideas travelled too. Architectural styles spread. Ceremonial practices changed. People knew places far beyond their own village. Those networks could make life more secure. If your harvest failed, perhaps relatives elsewhere could help. If your local stone was poor for toolmaking, trade could bring what you needed. If conflict threatened one settlement, allies might offer refuge. But networks can also break down. A bad harvest does not affect every place equally. One community may still have food while another faces hunger. An alliance that feels generous in good times can become difficult when everyone is worried about their own children. Long-distance exchange depends on trust, travel, labour, and the belief that cooperation will continue to matter. If those systems began failing, a village could become isolated even before its people physically left. Religious change may have mattered too. This is one of the hardest explanations to prove because beliefs do not preserve as clearly as stone walls. But places have meaning. A great house, a kiva, a shrine, a spring, a distant mountain, an old village where generations are buried. These are not just locations on a map. They are part of a community's moral world. When a society changes, old sacred places can change with it. A drought might be understood not just as failed weather, but as a sign that old rituals no longer worked, that leaders had lost legitimacy, or that people needed to renew their relationship with the world through movement. Leaving could be painful, but it could also be purposeful. A departure might mark an ending, a transformation, even a new beginning. This is why burned buildings are so difficult to interpret. Fire can be destruction, but it can also be closure. A family leaving a home forever may not want strangers entering it, reusing it, or disturbing what was left behind. Sealing a room, breaking a vessel, or burning part of a structure could be a way of saying, "This place has completed its life." Not every departure was a panicked escape. Some were probably planned. And that may be the biggest mistake in the popular story of abandonment. We imagine entire populations standing up one morning, looking at the sky, and fleeing all at once. But migration is usually slower and messier than that. One household leaves first, then another joins relatives in a different valley. A village loses a few families, then its ceremonial life becomes harder to maintain. Fields are still planted for a while, rooms are still repaired. Children are still born, but over years, perhaps decades, the centre of gravity shifts. Eventually, the old community no longer has enough people to remain what it was. So the city goes quiet, not because every person vanished in one disaster, but because thousands of individual decisions accumulated. Decisions shaped by hunger, fear, kinship, opportunity, belief, and memory. Decisions made by parents trying to protect children, elders weighing tradition against survival, leaders trying to hold communities together, and young people wondering whether a future existed somewhere else. Climate stress, violence, political fragmentation, religious transformation, planned migration. These do not have to compete as separate answers. They may have been parts of the same process. A drought can strain food supplies. Strained food supplies can sharpen conflict. Conflict can weaken alliances. Weak alliances can make migration more necessary. Migration can transform religious life, political authority, and the meaning of home. The mystery is not finding one perfect cause. It is understanding how a society responds when many pressures arrive at once. And once people began leaving, they were not stepping into an empty world. They were moving toward other communities, other valleys, other relationships, and a future that would reshape the Southwest forever. But this is where the language of abandonment can become misleading. A city can be abandoned, a village can be emptied, a cliff dwelling can fall silent, but a people do not vanish simply because they stop sleeping in the same rooms. That distinction matters. For more than a century, archaeologists and popular writers often described the late 13th century change as a disappearance. The ancestral Puebloans had built extraordinary communities across the Four Corners region. Then, within a relatively short period, many of those communities were no longer occupied in the same way. Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings went quiet. Villages on the mesas were left behind. Great houses, towers, kivas, storage rooms, fields and roads remained in the landscape. And when later visitors found those places empty, the obvious question was, What happened to them? But descendant Pueblo communities have always been central to the answer. The people who left did not disappear into some archaeological void. Their descendants are living communities today, including Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley, the Hopi Mesas, Zuni, and other communities across the southwest. The old settlements were not the final chapter of a lost civilization. They were part of a much longer history of movement, survival, adaptation, and continuity. The stone walls remained, the people carried the rest with them. They carried seeds, corn, beans, squash, and the knowledge of how to grow them in difficult country. They carried planting traditions refined over generations, where moisture gathered after a storm, how to use runoff, how to recognize a failing field before it failed completely. They carried tools, pottery-making skills, weaving techniques, hunting knowledge, and ways of building homes suited to new landscapes. But they also carried things archaeology cannot easily recover. Stories, ceremonies, songs, languages, clan identities, marriage ties, knowledge of ancestors and sacred places. A family leaving one village may have taken only what it could carry. But what mattered most was not always made of wood, stone, or clay. A grandmother could carry the memory of a ceremony. An elder could carry the history of a clan. A farmer could carry knowledge of seeds selected through centuries of dry years. Children could carry the language that connected them to relatives they had never met. That is why migration is not the same as disappearance. Imagine one household facing another bad harvest. They have relatives to the south, perhaps in a valley with more reliable water. Maybe they have traded with those people for years. Maybe someone from that village married into their family. Maybe they have heard that new houses are being built there, that fields are opening, that there is room for another family willing to work. So they leave. Not necessarily forever at first, perhaps they return seasonally. Perhaps they keep ties to the old village. Perhaps they expect others to follow after the next harvest. Then another household leaves. Then a few more. A settlement does not need to be destroyed to become impossible to maintain. Once enough families depart, there may not be enough people to repair roofs, tend fields, organize ceremonies, defend the community, or maintain the social obligations that made village life work. The remaining residents face a new decision. Stay in a place that is becoming smaller and more vulnerable, or join relatives where the future may be less uncertain. Over years, perhaps decades, these choices can transform an entire region. That is probably closer to what happened than the image of one massive column of refugees marching away from the four corners all at once. There may have been moments of panic. There may have been attacks, crop failures, and hurried departures. The archaeological evidence suggests that some communities experienced terrible stress. But migration also could have involved planning, scouting, negotiation, and reunion. People may have moved in waves, some families first, others later. Some settlements emptied quickly, others persisted longer. Some people may even have moved more than once before finding a place where their community could take root again. And the old places may not have been forgotten once residential life ended. This is another assumption that can distort the story. If no one lived in a structure anymore, modern observers may call it abandoned. But abandonment is not always the same as rejection. A place can stop being a home and remain sacred. A kiva can no longer host daily community life and still hold ceremonial meaning. A cliff dwelling can be empty of residents and still be connected to ancestors. A spring, a mesa, a shrine, a burial place, or a ruined village can remain part of a living spiritual geography long after the last household has moved away. For descendant communities, these places are not simply ruins. They are ancestral places. They are evidence of deep relationships between people, land, memory, and responsibility. That does not mean we can know exactly what every site meant after it was left. Archaeology has limits. A trail leading toward an old village might reflect trade, travel, gathering, ceremony, or later visitation. A sealed room might mark closure, protection, or something else entirely. We should be careful not to turn possibilities into certainty. But the broader point is hard to escape. The Four Corners region did not become empty because its people ceased to exist. Its settlement geography changed. The centre of population shifted south and east toward places with different farming conditions, different water sources, and existing communities that could absorb newcomers. What looks, from the ruins, like collapse, may look very different from the perspective of the people who moved. It may have been grief and danger, certainly, but it may also have been strategy. A decision to preserve families, traditions, and futures by leaving places that could no longer sustain them. The cities went quiet, but the civilization kept moving. And if we want to understand where it went, we have to stop looking only at the empty rooms behind and start following the people into the new worlds they built. So where did they go? The honest answer is not to one place. There was no single road out of the Four Corners, no master plan carved into stone, no surviving record that says every family from Mesa Verde turned south on the same day and arrived at the same destination. What we see instead is a web of movement. Families, clans, and whole communities appear to have moved along different routes, at different times, toward regions where water, farmland, trade connections, and relatives offered a better chance of survival. Some went south toward the Rio Grande Valley in what is now New Mexico. Others moved toward the Hopi Mesas in northeastern Arizona. Others reached the Zuni region, the Little Colorado River country, and Pueblo communities farther south and east. The old homeland was not replaced by one new homeland. It became many, and archaeologists can follow parts of that movement because people leave signatures behind. Not names, not diaries, not neat arrows on a map, but traces, patterns, little pieces of evidence that, when they begin appearing together in a new place, suggest that people had arrived from somewhere else. Pottery is one of the clearest clues. Every Pueblo community had traditions of making, decorating, firing, and using ceramics. A bowl is not just a bowl. Its clay may come from a particular geological source. Its painted designs may follow a local style. Its shape, temper, surface treatment, and manufacturing technique can reflect knowledge passed down through generations. When pottery traditions associated with the Mesa Verde and northern San Juan region begin appearing hundreds of miles away, archaeologists pay attention. At villages in the Rio Grande Valley, for example, researchers have found ceramic styles and materials that point north and west, toward communities that were being left behind. In some cases, the pottery itself may have travelled through trade. A beautiful vessel can move a long way without its maker moving with it. But when the pottery appears alongside new house forms, new cooking practices, different settlement layouts, and evidence for major population growth, trade alone becomes a less satisfying explanation. It starts to look like migration. The same thing happens with architecture. People do not always build exactly the same kind of home in a new landscape. They adapt. A family arriving in a river valley may not construct the same cliff dwelling or mesa-top village they once knew. The available stone is different. The weather is different. The defensive needs may be different, and they are building beside people who already have their own building traditions. But habits travel. The arrangement of rooms, the shape and placement of kivas, the ways walls are laid, the organization of plazas, the techniques used to store food or manage household space. These details can preserve echoes of where people came from. It is a little like hearing an accent. A person may move across a continent, learn new customs, marry into a new community, and raise children who speak differently. But certain words, certain rhythms, certain sounds can remain. Architecture can work that way too, not as proof of a single identity, but as a record of traditions meeting, blending and changing. Then there is the evidence written into human remains. This is a sensitive subject, and it should be treated that way. Human remains are not just data, they are ancestors. Modern research increasingly emphasizes consultation, respect, and the authority of descendant communities. Still, studies of skeletal traits, diet, and chemical signatures have sometimes suggested movement between regions. Isotopes in teeth can reveal information about where a person spent childhood because local water and food leave subtle chemical markers in the body. Changes in diets can show up in bones. Biological similarities between populations may suggest long-term connections. But none of this gives us a perfect migration map. A chemical signature can suggest that someone grew up in a different landscape. It cannot tell us why they moved, whether they travelled alone or with a community, or what they believed they were leaving behind. Biological similarities can reflect migration, intermarriage, shared ancestry, or older connections that existed long before the 13th century. The evidence is powerful. It is not a time machine. Still, when pottery, architecture, settlement history, and biological evidence all point in similar directions, the larger pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The late 1200s and early 1300s were not just a period when northern settlements declined. They were also a period when other Pueblo regions grew. In the Rio Grande Valley, large new pueblos emerged or expanded dramatically. Places such as Pottery Mound, Tijeras, and communities in the Galisteo Basin became part of a changing landscape of increasingly substantial villages. Population was concentrating in places with access to river water, floodplain soils, trade routes, and defensible terrain. Some settlements grew into enormous pueblos, with hundreds of rooms clustered around plazas and ceremonial spaces. That kind of growth does not happen because empty land was waiting patiently for settlers. It happens because people were gathering, and gathering is complicated. The receiving regions already had communities. They had their own fields, leaders, ceremonies, languages, obligations, alliances, and memories. New arrivals could not simply walk in, claim a piece of ground, and start building. They had to negotiate relationships. They may have joined relatives. They may have married into local groups. They may have arrived as welcomed allies, needed labourers, trading partners, or strangers viewed with suspicion. In some places, communities may have formed almost from scratch, bringing together families from several different regions. In others, migrants likely joined established pueblos and transformed them from within. Imagine the pressure of that moment. A family arrives after leaving a village their grandparents helped build. They need land, they need food, they need protection. But the people already living there have limits too. Their fields can support only so many mouths. Their water sources are not infinite. Their own memories may include violence, drought, and earlier migrations. So a new pueblo is not simply a collection of houses. It is an agreement about who belongs, who farms where, who contributes labour, who participates in ceremony, who marries whom, who has access to water, who stands beside whom when danger comes. That may be why the archaeological record after the migrations shows both continuity and change. Old traditions survived, but they did not survive unchanged. Northern pottery styles blended with local styles. Building practices merged. New settlement plans appeared. Communities became more diverse, more interconnected, and in some cases more tightly organized. At Hopi, Zuni, and across other Pueblo regions, descendant traditions preserve deep connections to ancestral migrations. These histories are not identical to archaeological reconstructions, and they are not required to fit neatly into an outsider's map. But they are crucial reminders that movement was not merely a demographic event. It was part of living histories of emergence, departure, arrival, obligation, and place. The ruins of Mesa Verde can make the story look like an ending. The growing Pueblos to the south reveal something else. The southwest was being remade, not emptied. Remade. And that remaking did not happen quietly. When people from different places gathered into larger pueblos, they brought more than pots, tools, and stored corn. They brought kinship ties, ritual knowledge, ways of building, memories of old alliances and old enemies. They brought claims to identity that may have reached back generations. And they entered landscapes where other communities already had their own claims, their own histories, and their own sacred responsibilities. This is the part of migration that ruins alone cannot fully explain. You can see a new room block added to a pueblo. You can measure the walls. You can identify pottery from another region. But the hardest evidence to recover is the human negotiation behind it all. Who gave newcomers permission to settle? Who decided which families could farm which fields? Who controlled access to springs, irrigation channels, hunting grounds, timber, clay, and wild plants? Who had the authority to lead ceremonies when several traditions now existed in the same village? There may not have been one answer, there probably wasn't. Some migrants may have arrived where they had relatives already waiting. A marriage connection from decades earlier could become the difference between being treated as strangers and being welcomed as family. Some groups may have exchanged gifts, labour, ritual obligations, or access to trade goods in return for land. Others may have joined communities because they shared language, clan connections, or religious traditions. And in some cases, people may have arrived under far less peaceful circumstances, forced by hunger and fear to seek space in a place that could barely support its existing population. Migration creates opportunity, but it also creates pressure. Imagine a valley after several years of drought. The harvest has been uncertain. Local families have already adjusted their fields, cut back on food, and watched water sources shrink. Then new families arrive from the north. They are hungry. They have children. They have skills, labour, and knowledge. Maybe they know how to make different kinds of pottery. Maybe they have distant trading partners. Maybe they bring ritual practices that local people value. But they also need corn. They need water. They need somewhere to belong. That kind of moment can produce conflict. It can also produce alliances strong enough to change an entire region. And the new Pueblos seem to reflect that process. Across parts of the southwest, settlements after the Great Migrations often became larger, denser, and more deliberately organized. Instead of small households scattered across the landscape, people increasingly lived in tightly clustered communities. Room blocks expanded around plazas. Multi-story buildings appeared in some places. Kivas and other ceremonial spaces became part of more complex village plans. Storage rooms, work areas, family spaces, and gathering places were brought closer together. A pueblo was becoming more than a place to sleep between planting and harvest. It was becoming a machine for living together. Think about what it takes to build hundreds of connected rooms. You need stone, timber, mud plaster, tools, food for workers, and people willing to coordinate their labour. You need rules, even if no one writes them down. Someone has to decide where a wall goes. Someone has to organise repairs. Someone has to make sure a roof does not collapse onto the family below it. And when a village grows larger, each construction decision affects more people. Architecture becomes social organisation made visible. A plaza is open space, yes, but it can also be a gathering place, a work area, a ceremonial centre, a place where news travels and disputes are settled. A kiva is not just a round room sunk into the ground. It can be part of a system of ritual authority, community memory, and shared obligation. Rows of connected rooms can show families living close together, but they can also reveal the need for cooperation, surveillance, and mutual defence. And defence mattered. By the late 13th century and afterward, many communities were choosing locations that were easier to protect. Some were built on mesas, ridges, or other elevated ground. Others were clustered tightly enough that the settlement itself formed a barrier. Outer walls had fewer openings. Access points could be controlled. Open country between households gave way, in some areas, to compact villages where people could see who was coming and respond quickly if danger appeared. Archaeologists debate exactly what these changes mean. Defensive architecture does not automatically prove constant warfare. A wall can mark a boundary. A high location can offer cooler air, better visibility, or access to nearby fields. Villages may cluster for social and ceremonial reasons as much as military ones, but when defensive locations, signs of raiding, population movement, and resource stress appear in the same broad period, it becomes difficult to dismiss security as irrelevant. People were not only building homes, they may have been building refuges. Still, this was not simply an age of fear. That is too easy. Too much like the old story where collapse leads only to chaos. Large mixed communities could be dangerous. They could also be creative. When people from different regions live side by side, they exchange knowledge whether they intend to or not. They see different ways of planting, cooking, making tools, shaping pots, arranging ceremonies, raising children, and organizing work. Some traditions remain separate because they matter deeply. Others blend. New styles emerge that belong fully to neither the migrants nor the residents, but to the community they are becoming together. That is one reason the archaeological record can look so complicated after migration. It is not because people lost their identities overnight. It is because identity was being rebuilt in real time. A family could remember an ancestral homeland while becoming part of a new Pueblo. A clan could preserve its own ritual responsibilities while forming alliances with other clans. Children could grow up speaking in ways their grandparents did not, eating food from newly cultivated fields, and treating a village founded by migrants as the only home they had ever known. This is what endurance often looks like, not preserving everything exactly as it was, changing enough to continue. The Pueblo societies that survived the upheavals of the late 1200s did not survive because they escaped history. They survived because they adapted to it. They formed new communities. They reorganized labor. They built stronger networks of kinship and exchange. They carried old knowledge into new landscapes, then added new knowledge as conditions demanded. The abandoned cities of the Four Corners were real. Their empty rooms still feel like evidence of disaster, but the growing Pueblos beyond them tell a different story. People did not vanish. They regrouped. They negotiated. They built, and in doing so they helped create the Pueblo world that endures to this day. And that is where the story becomes more complicated than archaeology alone can ever make it. Because the descendants of these communities are still here. Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Laguna, the Rio Grande Pueblos, and many other Pueblo peoples preserve deep connections to places that archaeologists label with modern names. Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, Bear's Ears, Hovenweep, Canyon de Chelly, the Four Corners. To an outsider, these can sound like points on a map, categories in a museum database, or chapters in a vanished civilization. But for descendant communities, they may be ancestral places. Places of emergence, migration, ceremony, obligation, memory, and continuing relationship. That changes the question. Archaeology often asks, why did people leave? But from a Pueblo-centered perspective, leaving may not be the end of the story at all. It may be one stage in a migration that continues through generations. A movement shaped by responsibility, by alliances, by sacred instructions, by environmental change, by conflict, and by decisions whose full meaning was never meant to be preserved in stone. That does not mean every oral tradition provides a simple answer to the mystery of the abandoned cities. It doesn't, and it would be disrespectful to treat Pueblo knowledge as if it were a code archaeologists can crack whenever they encounter an unanswered question. Some knowledge is public, some is shared within a particular community. Some belongs to clans, ceremonial societies, or families. Some is sacred, some is not intended for outsiders at all, and that boundary matters. For a long time, archaeology operated as if the past were an open archive. Find a ruin, excavate it, collect the objects, measure the bones, name the culture, build a theory. The people who lived there were treated as subjects of study, often described in the past tense, as if they had disappeared completely and left their inheritance behind for others to interpret. But that story was never true. The people who built the great houses of Chaco and the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde did not simply become lost. Their descendants did not vanish into an archaeological category. Pueblo communities today maintain languages, ceremonies, farming traditions, kinship systems and relationships to the land that extend across centuries of enormous change. Continuity does not mean nothing changed. It means identity survived change. That is a huge difference. Think about the way an archaeologist sees a migration. Pottery styles shift, building techniques appear in a new valley. Tree ring dates show construction accelerating in one region as it slows in another. A settlement is abandoned, another grows larger. From this evidence, researchers can reconstruct movement across the landscape. But a descendant community may understand that same movement through a different framework, not as collapse, not as people fleeing a failed society, but as a journey, a difficult one maybe, a journey marked by loss, danger, hunger and separation, but also one with purpose, a migration through places where ancestors lived, learned, made commitments, and eventually moved on. In that understanding, an abandoned settlement is not empty. It is still part of a living landscape. Its walls may be silent to us. But silence is not the same as absence. This is one of the limits of outsider interpretation. Archaeologists can excavate a room and identify hearths, storage bins, grinding stones, pottery fragments, turkey bones and corn pollen. They can estimate when the roof timbers were cut. They can identify where the stone came from. They can sometimes trace trade routes through chemical signatures in shell, turquoise or obsidian. What they cannot automatically recover is the meaning of that room. Was it simply a household? Was it connected to a clan history? Was it associated with ceremonies, responsibilities, or stories that remain known only within a Pueblo community? Was its abandonment a practical decision, a spiritual decision, a political decision, or all of those at once? The material evidence may narrow the possibilities, but it does not give outsiders unlimited authority to decide what a place means. And this is not an argument against archaeology. Archaeology has revealed extraordinary things. It has shown the scale of Chacoan roads, the engineering of cliff dwellings, the timing of droughts, the movement of populations, and the resilience of communities that rebuilt after crisis. It can test claims, it can challenge myths, it can show that a dramatic-looking abandonment was often a long process rather than one catastrophic day. But archaeology is strongest when it recognizes what it cannot do alone. Oral traditions can broaden the evidence. They can remind researchers that migration is not just a demographic event. It is a moral and cultural process. People do not move only because rainfall declines or fields fail. They move because of relationships, because promises matter, because certain places carry obligations, because communities must decide how to remain themselves while entering a new world. At the same time, oral tradition should not be mined for a single sentence that solves Mesa Verde or Chaco. That is another outsider mistake. Imagine asking a community to reveal sacred knowledge so someone can settle an academic debate about 13th century migration. The question itself can be backwards. Not all knowledge exists to satisfy public curiosity. Not all history is available for extraction, and not every tradition maps neatly onto archaeological dates, site boundaries, or the categories created by modern researchers. Oral histories are not primitive versions of written records waiting to be verified by science. They are their own forms of knowledge. They carry values, relationships, teachings, and ways of understanding time that may not fit neatly into a timeline of drought years and population estimates. Sometimes they may align closely with archaeological findings. Sometimes they may complicate them. Sometimes they may remain private. All of those outcomes deserve respect. This has practical consequences. It means consulting descendant communities before research begins, not after artifacts have already been removed and conclusions announced. It means recognizing tribal nations as authorities on their own heritage, not merely as sources of local color for museum displays. It means using language carefully. Ancestral Puebloans is widely used because it acknowledges living Pueblo descendants more clearly than the old label Anasazi, a term many Pueblo people consider inappropriate or offensive. Even then, no single phrase erases the diversity of Pueblo nations or gives outsiders permission to speak for them. Respect also means confronting the history of excavation itself. For generations, graves were opened, human remains were collected. Sacred objects were taken from ancestral places and placed in museums, private collections, and distant institutions. Researchers called this preservation. Communities often experienced it as dispossession. Repatriation is one effort to address that history. Under laws such as the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, museums and federal agencies have been required to identify and return certain Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony to affiliated tribes. The process can be slow, difficult, and incomplete. But the principle is profound. Ancestors are not specimens. Burial places are not resource deposits. Sacred belongings are not simply artifacts. Once you understand that, the mystery of the abandoned cities starts to look different. The question is no longer just, what disaster destroyed these people? It becomes, what can these places tell us about how communities endured crisis, made choices, preserved obligations, and carried their world forward? That question is harder. It has fewer neat answers, but it is closer to the truth. Because the stone villages of the Four Corners are not the remains of a civilization with no voice. They are part of a larger history whose descendants are still speaking, still living, and still deciding what should and should not be shared. And if we want to understand why the cities went quiet, we have to begin with one act of intellectual humility. The ruins belong to the past, but the past does not belong to us. So, if the ruins do not give us a final verdict, what do they actually reveal? Quite a lot, just not in the way people expect. An abandoned settlement is not a frozen photograph of the last day anyone lived there. It is more like a crime scene that has been exposed to wind, rain, animals, looters, excavation, rebuilding, and 7 centuries of collapse. Walls fall, roofs burn or rot away, pottery breaks. Wood disappears. Later visitors move things. Modern archaeologists uncover only part of the original picture. And yet the material clues still matter. Every room holds evidence of decisions. Storage spaces tell us what people expected to need. Hearths tell us where food was prepared and families gathered. Grinding stones or manos and metates tell us that corn was processed there, often day after day, year after year. Pottery can reveal cooking practices, trade connections, and changing styles that help archaeologists track the movement of communities across the southwest. Tools matter too. A stone axe left behind might mean it was broken, worn out, or no longer worth carrying. A usable tool missing from a room may suggest its owners packed it for the journey. Large grinding stones were often too heavy to move easily. Their presence does not necessarily mean people fled in panic. It may simply mean that carrying a massive slab of stone across rugged country made no sense when another could be made or acquired elsewhere. This is the first rule of reading an abandoned city. What was left behind is important, but what is missing may be even more important. At some sites, archaeologists find rooms that appear surprisingly clean. Few complete vessels, few valuable objects, little evidence of household equipment, simply dropped in place. That pattern can suggest an orderly departure. Families may have taken portable belongings, useful tools, food containers, ceremonial items, and things with personal value. They may have returned more than once. They may have moved gradually, shifting people and possessions over months or years. That is not what a single sudden catastrophe usually looks like. If an entire population had been wiped out overnight by one overwhelming event, we might expect to find a different pattern. More possessions left where they were used, more bodies, more direct signs of abrupt destruction. Those clues exist in some places across the broader region, especially where violence or burning occurred. But they do not appear everywhere, and they do not create one simple story for the entire Four Corners. Then there are the doors. In some settlements, entrances were deliberately blocked with stone. Rooms were filled in. Passageways were sealed. Roof timbers may have been removed for reuse. Kivas, communal ceremonial spaces, were sometimes closed or altered in ways that look intentional rather than accidental. At first glance, that can feel eerie. Why seal a room unless you believed you would never return? But even that conclusion is not automatic. A sealed doorway could mean people were closing a household carefully before leaving. It could mean a room had become unsafe. It could mean a building was being retired from use. It could reflect ritual closure, an action with meanings that cannot be fully recovered from the stone alone. The same physical act can have practical, social, and spiritual dimensions at the same time. This is the frustrating and fascinating thing about archaeology. Behavior leaves traces. Motives often do not. We can see that beams were pulled out of a structure. We cannot always know whether people took them because timber was precious, because they needed building material in a new settlement, because they wanted to prevent others from using the house, or because dismantling the old home was part of a deliberate act of departure. We can find a storage room empty of corn, but was it empty because the harvest had failed? Because the family consumed the food before leaving? Because they carried it away? Because someone else entered the room years later? The evidence can narrow the possibilities. It rarely speaks in a single voice. And that is why emotionally powerful assumptions need to be separated from supported conclusions. A cliff dwelling feels like the perfect image of terror. Homes high in the rock, ladders pulled up, narrow entrances, deep canyons below. It is easy to picture families hearing attackers approach, grabbing what they could, and disappearing into the night. That may have happened in some cases. The archaeological evidence for conflict is real. Raids occurred. Some communities were attacked. Some people died violently. Defensive construction became more common in certain areas. Fear was part of the world people lived in, but a dramatic location is not, by itself, proof that every resident was hiding from enemies every day. Likewise, an empty village can make drought seem like the obvious answer. And drought was devastating. Failed rains, exhausted soils, shrinking water sources, and crop losses could force decisions that no community wanted to make. But finding an abandoned room does not allow us to say with certainty, this family left because the rain stopped. People do not experience drought as a number on a climate chart. They experience it through empty granaries, through arguments over water, through children getting sick, through trade partners failing to arrive, through alliances breaking apart, through the fear that next year will be worse. By the time a family leaves a village, climate may be only one part of the decision. Conflict may be another, so may opportunity. Maybe relatives had already established a home near a more reliable spring. Maybe a new alliance offered protection. Maybe a community was gathering in a larger settlement. Maybe obligations, ceremonies, or long-standing migration traditions shaped the direction they chose. The ruins preserve the results of those decisions. They do not preserve the conversation around the fire the night before people made them. Think about what it would take for archaeologists 700 years from now to explain why a modern town was abandoned. They might find empty houses, roads, appliances, storage units, schools, and power lines. They could identify when people stopped using the buildings. They might detect wildfire damage, flood deposits, or evidence of economic decline. But could they know what a particular family felt? Could they know whether they left reluctantly, hopefully, angrily, or because their grandparents were already waiting somewhere else? Probably not. The ancestral Puebloan world deserves that same caution. The stone villages do reveal hardship. They reveal adaptation. They reveal communities using every available strategy, storing food, building defensible homes, maintaining exchange networks, relocating, consolidating, and carrying knowledge into new places. They also reveal planning. Even where life was unstable, people were not simply passive victims of collapse. Many departures appear to have involved selection, preparation, and movement through established social networks. People took what mattered. They reused building materials. They joined relatives. They founded or expanded communities elsewhere. The cities went quiet, but quiet does not mean defeated, and it does not mean empty of meaning. What these abandoned places reveal most clearly is not one final disaster. It is a record of human choices made under pressure. Choices that can be measured in sealed doors, emptied rooms, dismantled roofs, broken pots, carried tools and hearths that eventually went cold. The evidence is powerful, but it is incomplete. And that incompleteness is exactly why no single explanation has ever won. And that incompleteness is exactly why no single explanation has ever won, because every major theory explains part of what happened. None explains all of it. Drought is real. Tree ring records show that the late 1200s brought severe dry years across much of the southwest. For farmers dependent on rainfall, seasonal runoff, and small reservoirs of stored food, that was not a minor inconvenience. A few failed growing seasons could be the difference between stability and hunger. Corn harvests shrink. Stored grain disappears. Springs weaken. Wild plants become harder to find. Game animals move away or become scarce. But drought alone does not automatically empty an entire region. People in the southwest had survived dry periods before. They knew how to store food, move fields, gather wild resources, trade for supplies, and rely on kin in other communities. Drought becomes more dangerous when every possible backup plan is already under strain. And by the late 1200s, Many of those backup plans may have been failing at the same time. The landscape had supported large populations for generations. More fields had been cleared, more firewood had been cut, more game had been hunted. In some places, soils may have become less productive after repeated cultivation. Water sources that had once been reliable could no longer support every household that depended on them. Even without a catastrophic drought, there were limits to how much the land could provide. Then the rains weakened. That is when environmental stress can turn into social stress. If one family loses a harvest, neighbours may help. If an entire village loses a harvest, everyone is short. If several nearby villages fail at once, trade networks become strained too. The people you hoped would provide corn may be facing empty granaries of their own. Now imagine what happens next. Families begin leaving their smaller settlements and moving closer to dependable water, relatives, defensible locations, or larger communities. That movement puts new pressure on the places receiving them. More people means more mouths to feed, more demands on fields, more competition over springs, firewood, hunting grounds, and access to stored food. And competition does not always remain peaceful. The evidence for violence in the final centuries before the regional migration is difficult to ignore. Fortified settlements, restricted entrances, burned buildings, trauma on human remains, and episodes of massacre all suggest that some communities were living through real danger. Raids may have been connected to food shortages. They may have involved revenge, territorial disputes, political conflict, or attempts to control valuable resources. But violence was not equally intense everywhere. One village may have faced repeated attacks. Another may have been protected by alliances. One family may have lost relatives in a raid. Another may have left because their crops failed. A third may have moved simply because a sister, uncle, or marriage partner had already established a home somewhere more promising. This is the part that gets lost when we talk about the abandonment, as if every person experienced the same event. They did not. The Four Corners was not one city. It was not one kingdom with one ruler making one decision. It was a vast network of communities spread across mesas, canyons, river valleys, and high desert country. Each settlement had its own fields, water sources, trade partners, enemies, ceremonial obligations, and family connections. A drought map can show where rainfall declined. It cannot show which spring failed first. A defensive wall can show that people feared danger. It cannot tell us who they feared, or whether the wall was ever attacked. A burned room can show destruction. It cannot always tell us whether enemies set the fire. Residents burned the structure during a ritual closing, or a later accident swept through abandoned buildings. That is why archaeologists can look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. One researcher may see population pressure as the central force. Another may argue that political or religious systems were changing, especially after older centres like Chaco had declined. Another may focus on violence, seeing a region where trust broke down as resources became scarce. Another may point out that migration was already part of Puebloan life long before the late 1200s. People had always moved, joined other communities, founded new settlements, and maintained relationships across great distances. Maybe the final migration was not a total break from the past. Maybe it was an older pattern of movement, intensified by an extraordinary crisis. And there is another possibility that matters just as much. People do not leave only because the place behind them becomes unbearable. They also leave because somewhere else begins to look possible. A valley farther south may have had more reliable water. A growing village may have offered protection in numbers. Relatives may have sent word that fields were available, that trade was strong, that new homes were being built. A community with different rainfall patterns may have escaped the worst effects of the drought. Migration routes may have followed kinship ties built over generations. For someone facing hunger, fear, or uncertainty, the question was not necessarily, "Can we save this village?" It may have been, "Where can our children survive?" That changes the story. The ancestral homelands were not simply abandoned because they had failed. In many cases, people were making a difficult calculation. Stay in a place where food, water, and security were becoming less certain. Or risk the journey toward a place where family, allies, and opportunity might offer another future. Some probably left reluctantly. Some may have resisted until the last possible moment. Some may have returned seasonally for a time, visiting old fields, gathering materials, tending sacred places, or maintaining ties to ancestral homes. Others may have never come back, and because archaeology sees the material remains of movement more clearly than the human motives behind it, certainty remains out of reach. We do not have written records from the people who sealed the doors, packed their pottery, dismantled their roofs, and walked away from villages their grandparents had built. We cannot ask them whether drought was the final reason. We cannot ask whether they feared raiders, mourned lost harvests, followed religious obligations, or felt hope when they heard of a new community forming far away. What we can say is stronger than a single dramatic explanation. By the end of the 1200s, the ancestral Puebloan world was undergoing a major regional transformation. Climate stress likely made farming harder. Resource pressure narrowed the margin for survival. Conflict threatened some communities. Older social arrangements were changing. And established networks gave people routes toward new homes and new alliances. These forces did not arrive separately. They reinforced one another. Drought could deepen competition. Competition could fuel violence. Violence could push families into larger settlements. Larger settlements could strain local resources. Strain could make migration more attractive. Migration could transform political alliances, ceremonial life, and the map of the Southwest itself. There may never be one hidden answer waiting beneath the ruins, because the real answer may be that there was never just one cause, not a single collapse, not a single exodus, but thousands of decisions made by different people in different places, under pressures that were environmental, social, political, and deeply personal. The cities went quiet. The civilization did not disappear. It moved, and that may be the most important correction of all. The cities went quiet. The people did not. By the late 1200s, many settlements across the Four Corners region were being left behind within what, archaeologically speaking, appears to have been a relatively compressed period. Villages that had housed generations of families stopped growing. Rooms were sealed. Roof beams were no longer replaced. Fields were no longer planted. Great cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde Pueblos across the Kayenta region and countless smaller communities on mesas and in canyons gradually fell silent. From a distance, it can look like a civilization vanished almost overnight. But that is not what the evidence says. The evidence says people moved. They carried children, tools, seeds, pottery, stories, ceremonial knowledge, and memories of the places they had left. They traveled south, east, and west, joining communities along the Rio Grande, the Little Colorado River, the Hopi Mesas, the Zuni region, and other parts of what is now the American Southwest. Some settlements became larger. New towns formed, older villages absorbed newcomers. Alliances shifted, religious traditions adapted, languages, kinship networks, and trade connections continued across a changing landscape. The ruins remained, but the culture was never trapped inside the ruins. That matters because modern people often see abandoned buildings and assume failure. We see empty towers, collapsed rooms, and silent plazas, and we imagine the end of a people. We use words like collapse, disappearance, mystery, and lost civilization. Those words are dramatic, but they can hide the human reality. A family leaving an ancestral village was not necessarily witnessing the death of its world. They may have been trying to preserve it. They may have been doing the hardest thing possible in order to make sure their children had a future. Leaving a home can be an act of desperation, but it can also be an act of intelligence, cooperation, and survival. Think about what that journey might have meant. You are standing in a village where your grandparents lived. You know every path across the mesa. You know which wall catches the morning sun in winter. You know where water gathers after rain. You know the fields where your family planted corn, beans, and squash for generations. But the rains have failed. The harvest is uncertain. Wood is farther away. Springs are weaker. News arrives that there has been trouble in another valley. Maybe relatives have already left. Maybe someone has come with an invitation from a growing community far to the south. There may be water there. There may be safety in numbers. There may be people you know, and so you make a decision that no archaeological map can fully explain. What do you carry? What do you leave? What do you tell your children as the old village disappears behind you? This is why there will probably never be one final answer to why the Four Corners settlements were abandoned. Drought mattered. Tree rings make that clear. Environmental strain mattered. Conflict mattered in at least some places. Social and political change mattered. Migration itself may have created new pressures, but also new opportunities. These were not separate disasters lined up neatly in a row. They were connected. A dry year could become a failed harvest. A failed harvest could become competition. Competition could become violence. Violence could make a defensible town attractive. A crowded town could place more strain on land and water. And the presence of relatives elsewhere could turn an impossible choice into a possible route forward. That is not one cause, that is a world changing under pressure. And the ancestral Puebloans were not passive victims of that change. They responded with the tools every human society uses when survival is at stake: movement, adaptation, cooperation, memory, and the rebuilding of community in a new place. Their descendants are still here. Modern Pueblo peoples maintain deep connections to these ancestral places, even where stone walls stand empty and old fields have returned to grass and dust. For them, these are not ruins from a vanished civilization. They are homelands. They are places of ancestors, ceremony, obligation, and living history. So when we ask why the cities were abandoned, maybe we should ask something larger. What does it mean to survive when the place that made you who you are can no longer sustain you? What does it mean to leave without forgetting? The answer is written across the southwest. Not only in silent cliff dwellings and abandoned great houses, but in communities, traditions, and descendants who endured. The cities went quiet, the people carried on. If this story made you see these ancient places differently, let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from? And what do you think was the hardest part of leaving an ancestral home behind? And if you enjoyed this journey into the past, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify. The link is in the description.